Hi everyone, welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca and I work in the public programs team here at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians on this land, on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. Welcome to the first instalment of B-List for 2022. We had hoped very much to be welcoming an on-site and online audience to this series, but unfortunately, as New South Wales still battles with COVID, the State Library recently made the difficult decision to cancel on-site events for January and February of this year. This will also unfortunately mean that our February B-List will also be an online special. We are so very excited to be welcoming back Bri Lee to continue the B-List Book Club for 2022. And she starts this season with award-winning author, Professor Larissa Behrendt, as they discuss her latest book, After Story. After Story is available for purchase through the State Library's online bookshop. The shop website can be accessed through the homepage of the State Library website. And a quick mention that all purchases come with free delivery. Stay online at the conclusion of Bri's talk with Larissa, and she will be announcing the guest speaker for our February B-List Book Club. I now hand over to Bri with a quick reminder for all of you at home that we are using the Q&A feature for any questions that you may have for Larissa this evening. I encourage you to send these questions through at any stage during the talk, and Bri will moderate as many of questions as she can get through at the conclusion of her discussion with Larissa. I now welcome to your screens Larissa and Bri.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bri Lee. Thank you so much for deciding to spend your Thursday evening with us. I begin, as always, by acknowledging that we are on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are coming to you live from the beautiful State Library of New South Wales in Sydney, which of course means we're on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. I encourage you to take a moment and reflect on the not only traditional but rightful owners of the lands where you are watching us from this evening. When I say I acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, I also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, there has still been no treaty, and I support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Before we begin tonight, this is the first B-List Book Club for 2022. Thank you so much for joining us for another season. I'm really excited about this year's program. I do just want to take a moment, though, to thank the library staff. The State Library of New South Wales is not at the moment under sort of legal COVID restrictions, but we weren't able to gather in person because the library is suffering through staffing shortages due to COVID close contacts. And I think it's important that we take a moment to reflect on the immense loss of life. In January alone, over 500 people have died. These are not expendable people due to age or underlying conditions. And if you are watching and you have yourself been affected or had a loved one affected, I'm deeply sorry. Please know that you are not alone. And Lifeline is available 24 hours a day on 13 11 14. My guest tonight for the first B-List for the year is also the only guest to have ever had a repeat appearance on B-List Book Club. It is, of course, the fantastic Larissa Behrendt. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Larissa Behrendt is the author of 3 novels: Home, which won the 2002 David Unaipon Award and the Regional Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book; Legacy, which won the 2010 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing; and this one, which we'll be discussing tonight, After Story. She has published numerous books on Indigenous legal issues. Her most recent nonfiction book is Finding Eliza, Power and Colonial Storytelling, which long-term watchers would remember from a previous B-List Book Club. She was awarded the 2009 NAIDOC Person of the Year Award and 2011 New South Wales Australian of the Year. She is the host of Speaking Out on ABC Radio and is Distinguished Professor at the Jumbunna Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. Wow.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Before we get into this, I actually just wanted to ask you, I guess, a bit about your work in general. Finding Eliza for me was an incredibly impactful book. I loved that book, but I also really admired and appreciated it. And as somebody also who's previous books have been like issues-based nonfiction, who is now transitioning to fiction. I'm just dying to know, is that something you just slip between, or does it feel like a big changing of gears?
I do find I have to change gears between something that's more legal, perhaps not so much something like Finding Eliza, which was much more of a personal essay as opposed to, say, writing a legal brief. And interestingly, I've found that as I've gotten more into filmmaking, I find it quite an easy transition between that and creative writing. But I do struggle to find a gear shift when I have to go from something that's pretty heavy, legally, policy focused, and then find a breath to get back into the creative writing that I secretly prefer.
Is it that you have like a question or a topic or an issue that you want to explore, and then you like pick the medium that suits it, or do things come to you more fully formed?
No, you're absolutely right. I feel like you know there's a story you want to tell. And for me too, because I work across creative writing and filmmaking, there's the first question is this a story that is more powerful if you can create the space for it to be told in its true sense? And I love documentary because it's about true stories, and the truth is much more impactful. And then I guess there are stories like After Story and like the subject of my earlier books, where my novels, where I've felt that perhaps what I want to say that I feel is really important is either things that would be too close to home. The first two books were very much about my family, particularly my second book, which was about my relationship with my father. And sometimes feeling like the stories in their real life sense might not be my story to tell, but there's a way in which I'm engaging with them, and they say something to me and they reveal something about myself. That means I want to engage with them, and I would drift into the area of fiction writing with that. So in a way, you're absolutely right. It is almost like the story is kind of the thing that you work through, and it dictates the medium.
Can you explain? So I would love to hear more, actually. My question was, can you explain the work you do at UTS, at the Jumbunna Institute? But I also now want to hear a bit more about the documentary and filmmaking, and I guess how you imagine, or not imagine, how you picture all these different pieces going together.
And for me, they feel very holistic, because I guess what I knew early on was that my passion was about social justice. And I grew up in a really political family, with my dad's politics around Aboriginal issues, mum very staunchly feminist in her worldview. So I shaped my passion for social justice, but I was very lucky that I grew up in an era where people still didn't really identify as being First Nations or Aboriginal, but we knew we were, and we were really proud of it. My brother and I were brought up to be really proud of our heritage, and those two things I learned early on, and I feel like everything else that's flowed from that have been an expression of that. So, I became a lawyer to change the world. I learned.
Didn't we all?
I know, you watched To Kill a Mockingbird, and my dear friend, another filmmaker, Pauline Clegg, who's been a huge mentor of mine, said, yes, but didn't you realise it wasn't the courtroom thing that changed the world, it was the film itself? And I was like, oh, I wish I had realised that before I went to law school. It was kind of this insight, but like everyone, that was a really pivotal thing for me, and that's what I kind of imagined was me as a social justice warrior. And I to this day, I still am engaged with legal cases. So I've never stopped that, but I guess you do get to understand that you are a cog in a wheel when you go through the system in lots of ways, particularly in some of the areas I work in around child protection. And I guess that's what drew me to academia. Plus, being at university as a student was the first time I really found my voice. It was the first time I published. I remember the first article I ever published, I co-wrote with my brother, and it was about police brutality in Redfern, and it was called something like, I can't remember, it's like policing in Redfern, rotten apples or bad fruit or something like that. But early on, being able to find a way to speak out on issues. So I guess for me, I had an association with academia that was about social change and speaking out. And then I guess from there, in building up the unit at Jumbana, which has a legal clinic and then does work in the Indigenous policy area, and is very focused on self-determination. So we do a lot of our research work with the community controlled sector. That became a space that I was very interested in. And I guess through that, the last evolution has been working with the families, either the victims of crime, child removal experiences, or we do a lot of work with families who've had a death in custody. Hearing those stories, you're an advocate in that space, but you start to understand that how you tell the story, and as a lawyer, you're translating somebody else's experience for a courtroom or another process so that they can get their views across. You're a translator almost. I guess in the work I was doing with those families who were real advocates for change themselves, I got to understand that actually sometimes as an advocate, the best thing you can do is to create space for other people to tell their stories. And that's really what got me started into thinking about documentary filmmaking as a way of creating that space and giving an opportunity for people to tell their stories in their own way, and to use those documentaries as a vehicle for social change. So, I've done documentaries like a film called After the Apology, which was really about looking at the experiences of primarily Aboriginal women having their children wrongfully removed, but also about the enormous work being done, led by women in our community, to change that. So still very strengths-based approach, but that's kind of been the evolution. So in a way, it feels like the project's never changed. I guess my thinking about how to be a better advocate, how to be the best advocate, how to get change has matured and deepened over time as I've learnt more and more from the people that I work with.
Fantastic. I want to now move to talk about After Story. And I should mention for everyone watching, you absolutely can type in your questions for Larissa. I have a tablet here. I can see we have a couple already. Good. I have a tablet here, and I'll be leaving 10 minutes or so at the end and reading your questions to Larissa. So you can feel free to please type them in and send them through at any time. Okay. I don't normally ask, I feel like this is a lazy question sometimes, but I know there's got to be a good answer here. Can you start us off with the title, After Story?
It's funny because I really struggled with finding a title for this book, and it had many iterations over time. I'm not going to share any of them with you because they were all awful. And it was almost like I'd speak with Madonna Duffy, who's the publisher at UQP, who really nurtured me along. And we'd be sort of saying to each other, that's clearly a working title, because it's not that. And it really came long after I'd finished the book, and I was still trying to really find a title. I don't think I've ever struggled so much to find a title for a book.
The book does a lot of things.
Yeah, it's just, and I could never feel like I was doing something that gave it justice. And I just really back and forth with Madonna and Jacqueline, who was the editor on the book, about the ideas and the themes, but obviously story and story came up. We couldn't just call it story. So we were sort of thinking about that. And I guess for me, the reason why After Story felt right was a character in the book who is past in the book is, of course, Auntie Elaine. And I feel like she's still the glue. Like she is, she represents women who have passed on, who are very dear to me. And it was almost like the word after story kind of evoked how much of the story continues after their presence physically leaves us. And I guess for me, it resonated. And once that got thrown up, I sat on it and I thought, that is it. So it wasn't like I was writing it from the start. The next book I'm working on, I've got the title even before I've done most of the book. So it'll be a different answer the next time. But yeah, I really struggled with it. So it was a good question because I was very stumped by it for a very long time.
It fits though. It's perfect.
Well, now we know that.
Yeah.
It's like as soon as it was said, I was like, yeah, that's it. But gee, it took a long time to get there, and there are a lot of titles in the bin.
Well, they can say that. Can you please introduce us to Della and Jasmine, and I guess about this huge trip that they're about to undertake when we meet them at the start of the book?
Right. Yeah. So for me, I guess with Della, I was really inspired by people I knew and worked with who had been in a similar position of having lost a child in horrific circumstances, and for decades trying to come to terms with that. It's something that we see with victims of crime. We also see it with parents who've lost a child through a death in custody. I've been very honoured to work on the legal team for Latona Dungay, whose son died in Long Bay Hospital, and she is an example of that. And I guess for me, I was interested in the impact of that on a mother and daughter relationship. So I built the character of Della around somebody who'd had that experience, but drawing on some of my favourite Aboriginal women. Her voice came to me actually more quickly than Jasmine's, who was probably much more like me, and really represented that generation of women who didn't get the opportunities that my generation did. So she is a woman who's grown up in a country town, a very segregated country town, has had her life shaped by the racism of that town that even shapes the way she experiences life when the worst thing happens to her and she loses a child in these horrendous circumstances. And her daughter Jasmine is university educated, so a completely different ability to navigate the world and to see it. Jasmine also, though, grows up in the legacy of a town that has that segregation. She experiences it in a different way that Della does, but it shapes her. And her response to that has always been to try and fit in, to not be a troublemaker. She hides. She loves books, but she hides in them. She learns about the world through reading, which was something that I did too. But I think for her, unlike me, her trying to not rock the boat, to be a good one,
good girl.
A good girl, means that she steps away from her culture and doesn't embrace it the way that she should if she wants to be a whole person. So she's also struggling with that, and a big part of her insecurity and trying to find herself is the impact of being the child of parents who have had a child who's murdered. So she has the impact of her sister's death as a shadow over her whole life. And I guess I've observed that as I've seen a second generation of families go through trying to get justice. And there's a sense where they inherit the fight, and they also, which is a burden that they carry, and the grief that sweeps through a family from the loss of a child is something that impacts their relationship with their parents. And so those were some of the themes that I wanted to explore, and I crafted the characters very lovingly based on women I knew who could help me shape them into the characters of Della and Jasmine.
That's a beautiful response. Thank you. I'm interested in both characters and some of the supporting characters reference that they grew up in this small town where everyone knows everyone else's business and everyone's always gossiping. And there's a line in there that you could call someone down the street and tell them something, and by the time you've walked there, everyone else on the street has found out. But at the same time, there are huge and important and often devastating things that have been done to people or that have happened that are not spoken about. Can you talk about what this tension is, and I guess what effect it's had on Della and Jasmine's relationship, that everyone seems to sort of know everyone else's business and yet they don't seem to be having big conversations?
Yeah, I think in a way there were elements of that that felt very much to me like it was the community I grew up in. I was less defined by being my dad's daughter. When I went overseas was probably the first time I was able to be liberated from that. And I love my dad. I was never ashamed of that.
You still want to be independent.
Yeah, you don't want to be defined by that. And similarly, my brother had a big legal career while I was still off studying. And so when I came back to Australia, I'd often get asked if I was Jason Behrendt's sister. And I was, again, I'm so proud of him. I love it. I actually even got a t-shirt made with it on it,
Yes,
but he hated it so much. I promised him I wouldn't keep wearing it. But I was always, so it wasn't something that I shied away from, but I could imagine that. And so we all live in a world where we're defined by these relationships, and particularly in the Aboriginal community where we often live in places that are crowded. You don't even get the physical space to have quietness in many of our contexts, and everyone knows everything about everybody. So you do live in that kind of environment. That's incredibly comforting as well, I should say. It's not a negative in every way. There's many ways in which that is a wonderful thing. And people know you in the way our kinship system works, and they'll know things about the broader family, and the connections become very strong. But at the same time, I think in every family, there are things that people don't talk about and become secrets. And it's not, in a way, I guess, which is what I'm exploring in some ways in this book. It's not because people are trying to make them secrets. It's sometimes facing up to them as unbearable, and so they get buried. So we do it that way. We do it that way individually, and unfortunately we do it that way as a country as well. There is a whole way in which non-Indigenous Australia does that in a large way of not, we've become a lot better of recognizing that. But I grew up in an Australia where no one in my school, my brother and I were the only two children that identified as Aboriginal. No one else in that school knew about the stolen generations, and nobody knew that there were massacres. So we as Aboriginal kids knew that, but I could see even as a child those great silences. And I think when you live in those country towns, and my brother and I were actually born in Cooma. We lived on Norfolk Islands, and we spent a lot of time.
Norfolk Island?
Yeah, Norfolk Island.
Wow.
It's a little extra thing. So I was really used to small communities. Coming back to Sydney and being part of the community here in Redfern, and also out in Sutherland Shire, which has its own community, that felt very usual to me. There were other things about moving to a city that was surprising, but it wasn't that. We spent time at Walgett and Wallaga Lake growing up, and they were very much those types of communities where everyone knew everyone else. And in places like Walgett and Wallaga Lake, you could really see the segregation that still occurred there, and at a time when people did not talk about those things that happen. Even today, it's hard for us to have those honest conversations about history and how we tell a national narrative. So, I think on both the very personal level, there are secrets we hold, not because we want to be sneaky about it, but because facing the truth of them is really difficult and has consequences for people around us.
I want to talk about the setting and backdrop. It seems to me that a tour, like any kind of travel tour, is just ripe, now that I think about it, for a backdrop for a book. You're traveling with whatever, like a dozen strangers who you don't get to pick. You're traveling with them for sort of 10 days. You're stuck in close quarters with them quite often. There's a mother and a daughter traveling together, and they haven't lived together for a while, living in the same room. But also you're going from place to place, constantly being stimulated with new experiences and new settings and new information. It's like the most fecund ground for tension and for character development and everything. Can you explain the literary tour? And I know it mentions in the back that you took a literary tour. I guess, did you go knowing it would be a book, or did the book strike you when you were on it? The whole thing.
Well, I got the idea, as you say, it is a fantastic kind of narrative device. Your characters are stuck somewhere and they can't get away from each other. So it was brilliant in that way. I did have the idea early on. I had travelled with my mother when I was in my late teens, early 20s. It was the first time we'd really travelled overseas and as a holiday. We never took holidays as a, you know, in the same way when we were growing up, because we didn't have the money. So it was a, you know, something my mum worked really hard to do. And I ended up going along with her, and we would go on those trips. And I would say Mum and I get on a lot better. We don't have that kind of tension, but it's still pretty hard going to kind of share a room and on the bus, off the bus. And it did strike me as that. And in fact, the Boston sisters in the book were two actual people that we encountered on one of our trips who really stayed with me. And I thought, I've just got to put them in there, and people would have noticed they were probably the least literary of everyone there, but I felt like they'd earned a place. So I had thought that, and I guess I was interested, I guess, from my own experience of that, you know, I grew up reading those same books. I loved Jane Austen. I loved the Bronte sisters. I loved Dickens, D.H. Lawrence. It's still in our library. I loved rereading them in the course of writing the novel. And I have never lost my love for them and the reasons why I love them. But as I've grown more deeply connected to my own culture, as my father found his way back to our traditional culture, and I've been able to learn more about it and immerse myself in that culture, I started to learn about the importance of storytelling. So I've always, had the love of the literature and known the importance of story, but I've been able to deepen my understanding of how the two cultures work together. So it felt like the literary part was going to be a part of it too. So I hadn't worked out the whole of the storyline and how it would play out. I had a big broad stroke of it. And so when we went around and went to the different sites and what can you do in a day and how does it work and where do you stay? And oh no, that's the wrong village. It's actually this village and got ourselves all sorted. You know, it kind of allowed me to think through more deeply about how the story might play out over that time. And I guess the final thing to say about that, yes, it's great to have those tours for those reasons, and you get the kind of hothouse environment. But I think all of us who've travelled, if we can remember how we travelled before the pandemic, whether you go on a short trip, as the characters do, and I have done, or you also have the experience that I also had of living overseas for a longer period of time, where I was effectively 4 years overseas. You learn things about yourself that you never understand about them when you're here. Yeah. And I felt particularly for Della to have really been the first time she's in a different environment. How much would she learn about herself when she's there and seeing all those things? As you said, you get incredibly stimulated when you're in that environment, and you learn all about the country you're in and whatever particular thing you're looking at, whether it's the galleries or the music or whatever it is that you're drawn to, you're learning that. But I'm sure we all feel that we learn about ourselves when we're there. You're in a different context and you're testing yourself. And I've always been very interested in that idea, maybe because for me, it was the first time I was away from being defined by my family, but it was also the first time for me when I first went to live overseas where being labelled Aboriginal was not political. If I hadn't had that time of living overseas, I wouldn't have understood how politicised it is to be Aboriginal here. If you were the only Aboriginal person at your school or in your university class, or you're in all these different contexts, everything is political about who you are because of our history. And to me, it felt very liberating to be in an environment like I was in the States, where I was still able to engage with First Nations people and African Americans and have all those issues. But I was basically invisible, and it gave me, in a really positive way, a sense of the freedom that can come from not being defined by your external environment. I don't think it's a coincidence that I did my first creative writing class and my first filmmaking classes while I was studying there, where I could be a kind of different version of myself and explore things that I'm not sure I could have if I was here. And I think it was an important thing for me to learn as a creative person. because it made me realize how little we support creativity in Australia. I mean, you know, I always use this example, but if you get on if you get in a taxi here in Australia and your taxi driver says, I'm writing a screenplay, people will be dismissive, apart from the fact that we always think that those creative pursuits are, you know, aren't serious and not real work. But people are dismissive of that. But if you get into a taxi in the States and the taxi driver says that, the American will just go, well, what's it about and who's going to star in it? And, you know, there's a lot about American brashness that we rightly bristle against, and we won't get into that now. But if there's a positive on the flip side, it is that they really do think that you can do anything that you want. And I think I did, you know, I did take that on board. So when I came back and started writing more seriously and combined more creative work into my very serious legal and academic work, I felt like, you know, I could gauge that and support it mentally, because I knew how to be, how to contextualize any negativity around being creative that is part of a broader Australian attitude sometimes.
Yeah. I want to talk about this, I don't know what to call it. It's almost like a package, I guess, of these very sort of British and often colonial, like cultural products. And the tour is like hits all of the sort of high points of this, like, you know, the Shakespeare and the Dickens and the Virginia Woolf, things that, you know, we love, but it are very much undeniably part of a, like, I guess the canon, I suppose. What does, if we call that the canon for now, because actually, and part of it I have here is the Oxford and the Cambridge, you know, it's not just the creative cultural products, it's the institutions and the academy. What does that mean to Jasmine compared to what that means to Della?
You know, I love that Della has no reverence to it at all.
It's so good.
Yeah, you know,
she's the best.
She is great like that. And I love, you know, when I say she is kind of inspired by real women I know, a big part of, I guess, why I loved those women so much was because they were always able to cut through with a comment. And there's a very interesting way in which we interact with knowledge in our community. And in a way, it's one of the things that as Indigenous academics, when we've got Indigenous students and even now more non-Indigenous students, we start to use as an Indigenous methodology. So we're very used to asking questions about something and getting an answer on that question. And one of the things that, you know, knowledge holders in our community will do is you will ask a question and they'll give you the answer they think you should have. And it might not be the direct answer to your question. So often people will then say, no, when I asked you that question, I was really asking you why is the fence red? When in fact, if the answer has been something that feels to you like it's obscure, like, you know, we like to keep the gardens, you know, that the answer is something about the garden, it's your job then to go away and try and work out why that answer you got was the answer to your question. It's not your role to keep asking the question until you get the answer you want. And, you know, I kind of love that because it makes us have to really listen to what we're being told as knowledge and to really respect a knowledge holder. And we have to do the hard work. We can't assume we know the answer, and that if we do assume it, you know, we feel a comfort if we hear exactly what we want to hear.
Because discussion on any topic is so much about framing.
That's right.
If you can get whatever answer you want if you're the one who's allowed to frame the question.
And Della won't be framed. And I love that, you know, there's nothing about her education that's preconditioned her. All she knows is life. And the thing I really love about her journey is that actually she finds that she is a knowledge holder. She finds that she has wisdom. And it's not so much through her interactions with Jasmine. It's when the white Australians start asking her questions and she realizes she knows more than she realized because she's always listened to Auntie Elaine. So for me, her transition through the book is really powerful. And, you know, she is the symbol of the, you know, the non-academic, the knowledge, the lack of the canon. And, you know, I think for Jasmine too, it was really important to me that she did not diminish the canon. And as you rightly say, these are very emblematic of of colonialism. They're part of the colonial canon. They're taught in the institutions. But, you know, I think what you see with somebody like Jasmine is that she's still in a very early stage of trying to find her way through those two worlds. And that means kind of taking from both what can be most respected. As a young Aboriginal girl, the reason I liked Jane Austen was not so much the romance. It was what she said about women. You know, she writes across classes, mostly upper and middle, but there is still a lot in her book that relates to how women were treated as chattels and what the consequence of that is women. And that really spoke to me. Dickens talks about class in a way, you know, we don't talk about class like that here, but he explains that. He also is incredibly clever at explaining how law can reinforce injustice. There was so much in his books. You know, the Bronte sisters were always writing about what it meant to want to be a free self and being crushed by what was around you. So they weren't talking about Aboriginal people, but you as a reader, you know, you can read across cultures and find out what is in those stories that speak to you. And I learned a lot about the world from those books. And to me, even though they're part of the canon, that doesn't mean that those insights that those writers had about what life was like, you know, have no value. We have to be more clever about how we, you know, take things from one culture, even if it can be the cause of, you know, of colonization. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have those insights from people who within that culture itself are questioning the system.
There are lines throughout this book where Della and Jasmine and a bunch of other people talk about their differing opinions about the role of higher education in particular. And sometimes it's referred to as education, but it seems to be like a huge, the big sort of catalyst or leaping off point is university, is that leap with higher education. Jasmine talks about escaping their hometown by going to university. And when they visit the factory that Charles Dickens worked in, she uses the phrase, climb out of poverty through a better education. And she's referring to Dickens and the characters, but there's obviously an analogous there that she has expressed elsewhere. And then Della says, which really was very affecting to read, no one ever thought I'd amount to anything, and I do sometimes feel a bit sorry I didn't finish high school and set a better example for Leanne. And Leanne is Jasmine's sister. Della's other living daughter. And then elsewhere, though, Jasmine is grappling with what her formal university education has cost her and what her real motivations were for pursuing it. How can you talk about like higher education in particular? What does it mean to these different people and what it offers, but what it costs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I've spent over 20 years in higher education and, you know, both my father and my uncle were involved in that first wave. My father set up the first research unit at UNSW without having finished high school, but he had so much cultural knowledge and his work is lodged at AATSIS. So he was a scholar in other ways. And my uncle, Bob Morgan, a great Indigenous educator, had set up Jumbana, which I then came in to work at. Ran it for a while, and then I took a series of demotions to just work in research, realising that university administration was not for me. But, you know, I think one of the things that I find hugely rewarding about the space is, you know, every time we graduate one of our students, they are changing not just their own life circumstance, but the circumstance of their families and their communities. Almost all of our students would come in because they want to get that education to give it back. They want to be lawyers because they want to work for their own people. They want to be teachers, they want to be nurses, they want to be doctors because they want to work for their own people. Our most effective way of getting people into the STEM areas is to show how being an engineer can help you deal with issues of climate change in the Torres Strait. Show people how it connects to their community, and they love to do it.
Yeah.
And you see that capacity building. So to me, it's very exciting. We struggle with how you close the gap, and government policies fail after fail after fail. But you can see where we've seen great advancement, it's usually been through people becoming agents of change. And, you know, you look at somebody, for me, who was a real role model. I was very lucky to know her when I was growing up as a friend of my father's, but somebody like Linda Burney, I've seen her go through, who was also a very strong advocate of education, worked with the Aboriginal Education Consultative Group before she went into government, and then, of course, into government as a politician. You see somebody like her being an agent of change in all these different ways. So she's a wonderful example of of what I see. So I think what the challenge has been is, up until very recently, you would go into those institutions and you would have to navigate them as a non-Indigenous person. And you asked earlier on about Jumbana and what it meant. One of the things it means to me, and I've been reflecting on this very deeply in the last couple of months, when I haven't had as much time in the physical space, is as much as it's a place where we do great research and run cases and do really groundbreaking work, I love it because it's a culturally safe space for me. And I don't think many people would say that about where they work at a university, but no. Because we bring together this group of like-minded people. And I think over the last particularly 10 years, as we've seen more Indigenous academics come through across every discipline. I mean, at UTS, we have a senior Indigenous academic, not just sitting in Jumbana outside of the faculties, but every faculty has a senior Indigenous person. And they're funded for an Indigenous person at a professorial level to ensure that Indigenous presence is coming through every discipline, not just the humanities, because that's kind of, people think that's the health, that's the easy stuff. But you know, you have to integrate it through science and through engineering. So we have seen this change, and we spoke a little earlier about the idea of Indigenous methodology, which I touched on very briefly. But we are seeing different ways to approach research. And the other thing where I think we've seen a huge shift is, in the last couple of years, even the Australian Research Council has started to think about, well, what's the impact of research and how do we measure that? Every First Nations researcher I know only went into research to have impact in their community. You start from that point, not, oh, what's my interesting question now? How do I make that a real world thing? So, you know, I think the change that's happening now, that I would hope somebody coming through higher education now, that Jasmine didn't have and would have been fighting against as I did, as my peers did, especially when many of us were first in our families to go through, is that we are challenging the traditional ways of doing academia, and we are bringing in Indigenous knowledge systems, and we are bringing in Indigenous methodologies. And, you know, that is changing the landscape. So for me, I feel like that fight that Jasmine had to try and not lose herself in the academy was very easy to feel like it was a very big part of how you had to fight to survive as a student, to survive as an academic. And I hope that we are now at a point where we have enough Indigenous people that's changing.
When they're on the tour, it's the worst possible timing. A girl goes missing from Hampstead Heath. And of course, they're both immediately triggered, but in sort of different ways. Can you talk about what it brings up for them and how they start dealing with it? Sort of, because they kind of deal with it separately. They don't necessarily talk about what they see on the news. And Jasmine goes to switch off the news thinking that her mum doesn't want to hear it. And then her mum sort of says, no, turn it back on. I was listening to that. Can you talk a bit about that terrible timing?
Yeah, and I think those things sort of self-select in a way as well, because, you know, it's sadly not an unusual thing that we would have a high profile missing child or murder victim. If anything, I guess with the work of the Me Too movement and the amazing work done by a diverse number of women, that we have more conversations about more diverse people, and particularly nobody would ever talk about domestic violence murders, and we talk about them now, as we should. but you can switch on a television anytime in most places and there will be that type of story of a child or a woman who has been the subject of a horrendous crime. So it didn't feel like, you know, you had to search for that would come up. And in fact, I had that experience on a trip with my mum, that we were following a case that was happening in the southern part of England, where we did a tour of Devon and Cornwall. Not literary at all, we just went to other things, but you know, and it kind of reminded me that could be something to really be a mirror. And I felt like it was a powerful way to show a commonality, that what happens to Della in a little town in Australia as a mother of a murdered child is something that she still connects to, but it brings up so much more. And for Jasmine, it's really, you know, it triggers in her usual thing, which has been to soothe, and you know, she struggles with whether she's enabling, you know, where is the line. But you know, I think she also feels like she becomes the parent. That often happens when a parent is traumatized, that it is a burden on the children, and particularly an oldest child. So you know, it felt like that could be something that, beyond the literature, which of course Della hasn't read and doesn't need to have an experience, that this would be something that could be almost a mirror for them, and something that would be deeply triggering, and would be something that Della would be exposed to wherever you go. I mean, this is the horrendous thing. You know, there's an amazing power I see when I see, say, a group of families who we've been working with, who've all had a death in custody, come together and be in a group where everyone else knows exactly what that's like. And it's not something you can offer as an advocate, but you can see the power of that. And I guess I kind of wanted to give Della something that she understood and could see, and that spoke to her and validated her experience, because so often people get uncomfortable with it, which is, you know, one of the things I observed. People are, when the murder has been so long ago, there's almost a sense that you should have been able to move on. It's extraordinary to hear that attitude. I wanted things that would show us how raw this was for Della.
For everyone watching, I have time for 1 or 2 more questions for Larissa, and then I will be going to your audience questions. So type them in now if you have them. When Brittany first went missing, the first officials to come and ask Della questions turned out to be child protection, not missing persons. And the first response from the state was not to search for a missing girl, but to blame and seek control over the family, Della in particular, and maybe even look at taking the other sisters away. Della is later thinking to herself that horrific things happen behind rich families, closed doors, and nothing gets done about those. We know that Australia criminalises poverty. How does that intersect with the criminalisation of poverty, but how does that intersect with Indigenous families and communities in particular?
It's such a good question. And obviously the child removal issue is one that is really close to my heart. Granddaughter of a Stolen Generations member. My father grew up in an orphanage. One of the things I'm very proud of my father about is that he was, after finding his own family, a founder of Link Up, and he helped many other people reconnect with his family. I find people all the time who I don't know who come up to me and say, your dad helped me find my family. So I work in that space with an amazing team at Jumbana. The work's now headed by an extraordinary First Nations person called Dr. Paul Gray, and we work very closely with the community controlled sector. We've had the privilege of working with the Grandmothers Against Removal. So to see the number of Indigenous children in out-of-home care continue to rise, there was another report came out just today. Aboriginal children are 11 times more likely to be removed. And you look at that figure and you think, well, we've had an apology, what the hell is happening? You can see in the casework we do exactly that point you were making, which is poverty is criminalised. Middle-class white people who become workers in this space look at poverty and think these children are neglected. So many times I see that. There's a whole lot of other complicating factors, and I'd really encourage people to look at the Family Matters campaign online, which has so much information about this. community controlled campaign in this area. And we worked with them on the film after the apology. And this is the reality of it. And this is that space where if I tell you those statistics, it's hard for you to understand how egregious the individual cases are. You really need to see the cases. And I find this a shocking thing, even in my own community with our whole history. When people hear docs have become involved with a case, people often just naturally think there must have been a reason. And I can tell you from the casework we do, there is often no reason, or it's an assumption. I've had several cases where children have been underweight. People have looked at those children and said, oh, they're neglected, removed the children before asking a single question. 8 or 9 months later, that's how long it takes you to get to court. You can show all the medical documentation to show there is a legitimate medical reason why that child is underweight. And the parents have done everything to make sure that child is looked after well. Doctors, nurses, writing letters to say how well the child's looked after. But you have a family and children traumatized for that period. This is an area that is full of injustice. So we only just touch on that. It felt like it was something that would be very real about that experience for somebody. I mean, I've had a case where a woman who left a violent relationship had her children removed on the basis that the shelter she was in was not safe for those children. How is that a good response for anyone? And if we're still seeing those cases here in 2020, well, that was 2021, but 2022, you know, how are we taking responsibility for this system? So even in a line like that feels like it's a small thing, it speaks for me to a much larger problem that I hope readers get a sense of and we'll find out more about.
I've got like 20 questions I didn't get to ask.
Sorry, and my answers are so long.
No, it's fantastic. No, this is like, it's been wonderful. Okay, this is like quite a subtle one, but I think there's something here that I would really love to hear you speak to. Who we haven't gotten to much, apart from Auntie Elaine, is Leanne, Jasmine's other sister, the sister who's still alive. They're very different women. Jasmine is reflecting on Leanne's reputation as being, and I quote, a mouthy Aboriginal woman who stands up for herself, and that's both to be feared and derided. And Jasmine says, I'd tried to be the one who defied expectations and went to university, and for what? How had entrenched racism in my hometown changed in one single way because of my meekness and trying to prove a point? Leanne never felt the need to prove anything to anybody, and from somewhere inside, I felt a sudden twinge of jealousy. I would love for you to speak into that twinge. What is she jealous of? What is that thing that she starts?
And it is that thing. I've seen it with other sisters, but and I probably embarrass my brother more than he embarrasses me because he's a very quiet, thoughtful person. But you know, I think that the idea that Aboriginal women are opinionated and speak out, I think all of us will say we know when we do that, people hate it. We get trolled, we get demeaned, we get trashed in the right-wing newspapers. There's a thing about being a mouthy Aboriginal woman that really angers some people.
And it's based on the stereotype that's as old as anything.
Yeah, that's right. And first of all, that women they should smile more, you know? And then you add in the racial dimension, then there's a whole, many layers to that. We're supposed to be domestics. We're not supposed to be opinionated and mouthy, which is one of the reasons growing up in Sydney, we knew the stories of women like Barangaroo who were outspoken women, and you go and look through the diaries of the white men writing about her. It's it could come from a Murdoch newspaper writing about Aboriginal women who are mouthy today. So there is that sense, and I guess what I was exploring with Jasmine is that she thinks the way to navigate the racism around her is to try and be one of the good ones, to try and be more, to behave, to not rock the boat, to be. And we hear this all the time. I mean, I would get told that when I was at school, you're one of the good ones. And it's such an insult, right? And
the intellectual equivalent of pretty for an Aboriginal.
That's right, exactly, which I got too. Or don't worry, you can't tell. You know, there's so many ways that even as a child, you hear the negativity and the expectation that you have to be more like a white person. And she goes down that path that I see so many people have done, where she thinks that's the way to do it. But at the end of the day, it's a trap, because you never get accepted. And I think her epiphany about Leanne is for all the things that made her cringe about Leanne, who was brash and unsophisticated and makes life choices that Jasmine would never make for herself. She's never apologized for who she is. She's never been embarrassed. She's never tried to please anyone. And I think that's where the kind of jealousy comes from. How free is it to not be constrained by that? You know, I love the character of Leanne, actually. And I found Jasmine the hardest character to write in the book, even though she was the most like me. And maybe we could deconstruct that another time. But you know, I felt that moment where she starts to really see Leanne, which comes as when she starts to really see her mum as well.
There are ways that she speaks. Sorry, there are ways that she speaks about her mum in very, particularly sort of early on in the tour, that are very dismissive and hurt a lot to even read.
In fact, everyone on the tour, really, except Lionel and Meredith, are really dismissive of her. She's invisible to them. And that's why, for me, it's that powerful moment when she finds her voice. And for the astute readers, they'll know that's when I flipped the voices, that Jasmine starts as the first voice. Once Della has that moment where she tells the first story she remembers of Auntie Elaine's and starts to feel her, almost like the beginning of her cultural eldership, she's going to fill in Auntie Elaine's steps. The chapters swap, because she's the one whose voice is now the strongest.
Okay, questions from the audience. Sorry, I'm just making sure. Sometimes there are repeats and I like to go to those first. All right, a question from Melissa. I loved the scene at the museum when Della says, "We already gave" to the guard.
I love that too.
It's a perfect line, but I was curious. Was the line just about the museum or about much more than what was at the museum? It wasn't until later that I considered it might be the latter, and it hit me hard when I thought about what was taken and the impact. For such a simple line, it was very impactful. Also, thank you for this story. I loved it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, it was supposed to be a bit of a double thing, and it was taken from a real life example. One of the dear friends of mine who sadly has passed very recently, but I just loved her. She was a very big part of my bringing Della to life. And it was something that she would say when she would walk into the National Museum of Australia, and we'd often be at AATSIS, which people might know is not far from there, and we'd walk over to have a cup of tea in the coffee shop, and she'd always, not that you were required to, but she'd always say that, and you know, she was smart enough to know the both meanings of what she was saying. So that was a classic line from her. I loved it too. It stayed with me, and I was you know, I was keen to I couldn't not put it in the book if we were going to a museum.
A question from Victoria. Hi, Larissa. I absolutely loved the book. It was my favorite read of 2021.
Oh, thank you.
Could you speak a little about the similarities between the missing child in After Story and the Bowraville children? Was that intentional to highlight that case?
Obviously, I worked a lot with the families of Bowraville, and I was I've been very influenced by them. When I talked earlier about developing my skills as an advocate and learning the importance of storytelling and creating space for people, I learned a lot of that through my work with the families there. So I'm incredibly fond of them. There were elements of it that obviously spoke to that, and I hope people do become more interested in not just the horrendous thing that happened, but the enormously powerful fight the families have had to try and get justice for those children. But to be honest, there were actually quite a few stories that are woven in there that were very, you know, that are very tragic. and probably now, ironically, haven't got the same level of attention. And particularly, so for example, children going missing, not being taken seriously and referred to as walkabout is something that's happened much more often, particularly when those children are older, much like two of the Barraville children were. But, you know, if it's particularly young girls who are sort of 14, 15, 16, and they disappear, those disappearances are never taken seriously. We've had quite a few cases that my team at Jumbana has worked on with families to try and get proper investigations into women who have disappeared, where the family is absolutely sure it's been a murder and it's been such a lag in time before it's been taken seriously. And it happens as it happened in Barraville, as it's happened in the fictionalized example. It means the ability to solve those crimes is almost lost. Forensic evidence is lost. Eyewitnesses move. You know, it becomes almost impossible. So it was inspired by Barraville, but by a lot more than that, because unfortunately, the structural racism that they experienced, both in the investigation of their cases and their attempts to get through court, are just so systemic that they happen quite often. In fact, the one thing that I wanted to do in the book was to solve the murder and have someone convicted for it, because with many of the families I've worked with, including the Barraville families, that has not been the outcome for them. So in a way, that was a bit of a wish and a hope. But even then, to show that even with the that sense of what people might call a closure, it does nothing at all to ameliorate the grief. And I particularly think of our families where there's been a death in custody that's been ruled preventable. And as people would know, there's never been a conviction for murder in this country of anyone in that context of a death in custody, whether that's with the police or within the prison system. So there are a lot of
500 now, isn't it?
Yep,
deaths in custody and
not one conviction. There's a couple going before the courts now, which you know may change that, but only a couple. And if you look at the track record, you wouldn't be holding your breath, but we can always hope, having seen such seismic shifts in this issue. You know, but that's a lot of grief that people live with, knowing after a coronial inquest that the death was completely preventable.
Yeah. The irony too about that age that the girls go missing is that we know that is like the age at which you are most vulnerable to either sexual or physical violence.
Absolutely.
Just a lovely comment I want to read from Fiona. I just loved this book. The characters of the mother and daughter and their family and what happened to them, but also the plot was so interesting. My mother also read the book and she loved it as well. My sister is currently reading it. I have also recommended it to other people as a must read.
Oh, how lovely. My mum read it. She said, you did a good job.
Is that like the best?
That's the best I'm going to
do. The final question I want to get to is just that people want to hear more about Auntie Elaine.
Oh, thank you. Because yes, she was also an amalgam of some amazing women, including an actual Auntie Elaine who I met while I was doing the Barraville murders, and was just an extraordinarily important person in my life. And I guess for me, what she symbolises is, and people who work in Aboriginal communities will know this, that we often have one or two or a little group of aunties who do everything. And they are the backbone, and they'll be the ones who do the breakfast and lunch programs, the ones who are doing the clinic, the ones who are doing the liaising. You can see these women around Redfern, the Millie Ingrams, the Arnie Bronwyns. I've seen them my whole life. And they are unsung, and they sit there as the glue of the community. And for me, Auntie Elaine was that person. She's the custodian of the knowledge, but she's also the person. She's the person Della's closest to. She's the person that Jasmine's closest to. And it's really through their relationship with Auntie Elaine that they find their way back to each other. And to me, that really symbolised the role that those women play. And that, we started almost off on this point that the after story is that she can do this even when she's no longer physically there, when she's passed on, because her presence is so profound. And we all will tell you, we feel them when they're there. I'm sure it's not just a First Nations thing. When you have somebody very strong in your life, you continue to feel them with you long after you've gone. I still hear my dad's voice in my head all the time, but I feel Auntie Elaine from time to time, just as I do with the woman I based Della on. And for me, it was a way of really honouring that she was the custodian. And as people would know, we had in our traditional culture women with their own sphere and their own power, not like Western cultures where women have been subservient for centuries. The stripping away of Aboriginal women's power and equality came with colonisation, and we see it maintained. And I guess for me, this would probably be a good point to look at. I think there's more interest now in Indigenous knowledges than ever before. And we see that with interest in fire burning and the knowledge around caring for country. We didn't become the world's oldest living culture just because we knew how to live with the land. We knew how to live with each other. And giving women their rightful place and their rightful power in society was a really big part of that longevity. Why are we the world's oldest living culture? Because we respect elders, we respect knowledge, and we respect women, are all part of the many reasons. And so, I guess I like to emphasize that when people have an interest in our understanding of the stars, great. Our understanding of our cultural practices, wonderful. Our understanding of our land management, amazing. We're not going to address climate change without it. But think about how we respected women and older people in our community and their knowledge. And that's a big part of it too. And really, when we see our communities being rebuilt, when they've been started to come together and get strong, there are examples of this around the country. It's usually because it's being led by women. Women like Auntie Elaine.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much. This has just been, I loved the book, and this has just made my love for it so much deeper.
Thank you.
I told you I cried at the end of it, but I got so much out of it all the way through. And
thank you.
I'm really thrilled you could join us again.
Thank you. It's been lovely. And thank everyone for being here and the wonderful questions and comments too.
Just before we go, happy to announce that next month's book club is on Thursday, the 24th of February. The online event listing will go up next week. It's called Facts and Other Lies, nonfiction, by a man called Ed Coper, who's been involved in a huge number of campaigns for, yes, politicians, but also sort of change makers more generally. The book did a great job of explaining to me, I suppose, things like the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Also helped me understand, when we talk about people being in bubbles and like being stuck in their own informational bubbles, what that means, where that comes from, what responsibility big tech has for that, what it is as well in our human nature to seek out sort of communities and like-minded people. That means we can get further and further into those bubbles. And I just really wanted to do it in an election year. So that's next month for B-List. And for now, just one more huge thank you to Marcello and the library staff and Beck as well. And of course to Larissa.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night.